learned from somebody in your small group during your breakout session. So can I have some volunteers to share something that you learned from someone in your small group? And you can speak out loud, or you can just type in the chat, whatever works best for you.
Hello. So in my group, I spoke with Margaret and I spoke with Maho, and we all spoke about our food and what we like and then our courses. Margaret is in leadership, and what I realize is all of us, even though we are studying in different sectors, they are all connected. All our studies is connected in some way. So that was really amazing for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Do we have someone else who would be willing to share?
So I got to know that the beautiful castles that I need to visit there, and the cherry blossoms are something that I must never miss. And the other wonderful thing is I do malaria research, and I got to know Ehime University has a very good malaria research done there. So yes. Malaria, yeah, you should come.
Wonderful, thank you. Can we get maybe one last person to share something that you learned in your small group discussion? One more brave volunteer. Who do we have?
I can go. So in my group, there's a lot of students that were from Ehime, so they're telling me that I should definitely go visit their hot springs, and they're famous for their oranges. So it's a little smaller than a typical orange, but they said that you can peel it. I think it's like a cutie. So they really suggested the hot springs and the little oranges. So that's what I'm excited for if I ever go there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Carrie. Yes, I'm familiar with those oranges. That's kind of the mascot of Ehime University. Is that right? Yeah, I have a bag with that orange on it. It's very cool. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Jason now. Thank you, honey, to introduce the next part of the session. And ambassadors, again, thank you so much for being here. If you are able to stay and you'd wish to stay, that would be wonderful, but it's okay if not.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you, ambassadors, for coming. If you wish to stay, that'd be great. And we welcome you to stay. But the next portion of our section is the medicine portion. So we're going to have a special guest speaker, Dr. Duncan Reed. I believe, Ruth, did you send some information about Dr. Reed? I mean,
Yes.
you can also introduce yourself, Dr. Reed. So what's going to happen is, first, Ehime students and Kanwan University students, if you could please type in your name and what you're studying right now in the chat, so we can kind of get a general idea of what everyone's studying. And so Dr. Reed can also see what you're studying as well.
I am also putting Dr. Reed's bio up on the screen as well as we are getting started, just so you can see a little bit more about who he is and what his background is as he'll be speaking with you.
Thanks, Alifa. Got some chemistry, epidemiology, analytical chemistry. Nursing, medicine. Thanks, everyone. More medicine. Anatomy and biochemistry. Mathematical sciences. We got a lot of different people. More chemistry, medicine. Great, 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 great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And we got one mathematics. Wow. Definitely tried that. And then I was like, meh. All right. So I'm going to turn it over you to Dr. Reed right now to introduce yourself and what led you to your current role and a brief explanation of your specialties.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, well, it's so nice to meet you. I think the first thing is that after I heard about this in Ehime University, I had to look up everything about the area because I had never really thought about Shikoku or any of those things. So I feel bad that I missed the recent breakout sessions, but it sounds like there's a lot of interesting things in the area. So nice to meet everyone. So I think just to give you an idea of who I am, I'm actually born in California. My mom's actually from Japan. She was born in Tokyo, moved here in the late 70s, American father. I ended up going to university in upstate New York. I was planning a career in evolutionary biology, particularly fish. So I wanted to be an ichthyologist. And I spent a year studying fish in Central Africa. And then I just began to develop an interest in studying medicine, I think, because of a lot of the illnesses and issues that I saw there. I completed a master's in molecular biology. I was studying a stickleback fish, which also occurs out there in the Sea of Japan. But then I ended up applying to medical school. I graduated from Yale School of Medicine in 2015, did my training here, and now I work in an international medicine clinic at a county hospital, so it's Harborview Medical Center at the University of Washington. And this clinic is special because it specializes in the care of non-English speaking immigrant patients. And we have a number of patients who are refugees and were fleeing war and persecution. And I also perform health screens on recent refugees. So I'd say the majority of our patients are from Vietnam, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea. And then we get smaller populations from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and from South American countries. So that's kind of my story. So it probably doesn't make sense, right? But I am where I am and I'm happy to be here. So.
And we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. All right. So this next section, I'm going to ask a few pretty open-ended and broad questions to Dr. Reed. And I am going to type them in the chat as I ask them so everyone can follow along with the question. So Dr. Reed, what are some challenges you faced in working with patients from diverse backgrounds? And how did you overcome these challenges?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I see a diverse faces in the crowd too, some of them associated with the Ehime University. And I guess at some point, I'd like to learn more about that because it's not my vision of what I expect a Japanese university to be. So I think it's good that there is that diversity aspect. In the United States, I think if you look at it, there's just this history of immigration. It's a nation of immigrants. So there's just a lot of diversity that you see here, probably more than in most countries. So I think the biggest thing, so diversity spans a lot of different things. So language, culture, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity. I think just to start up with some examples of what we deal with, I think the first one is language. So we come into clinic and our clinic specializes in non-English speakers. So if you speak English, we don't see you here. So when we have, sometimes we have in-person interpreters, but very often we have a telephonic interpreter, which makes conversation very challenging. And it's actually very difficult to determine what's being translated. I think probably the majority of you are bilingual or more, and you realize that there's not a one-to-one correspondence with translations. So I think that can be a big barrier. Some words or ideas are more difficult to translate too. So this idea of depression, so we have a depression screen in English, and even if you translated the words word for word, I think a lot of the sense and the meaning is very culture specific. So I think language is a big thing that we interact with. I think another one is just cultural challenges, and it's a different way that different cultures express themselves. I mean, there's a traditional Japanese way of expressing yourself, right? At least being respectful. And then even just among the different African cultures that we interact with, there's just different expectations about the way you need to interact I think for one, I was taken aback. So some Somali patients, especially the men, were very forceful, and I thought that they were actually angry during the visits. And they would just mention an overwhelming number of issues that they had. And only later did I realize that this was just a cultural expectation in terms of you need to prove to the physician that you're sick enough, and that they're not angry, they're just standing up for themselves. So from my even point of view, it was a learning process to understand the different ways of expressing across cultures. And I think another big thing that I just want to mention is that race and ethnicity often affect how people are treated in American society. So establishing trust between that relationship between the physician and the patient can be very challenging. I told you that my mother is Japanese, but maybe looking at me, you see me as a white person. And I think in the hospital setting, I'm treated as a white person. So depending on the race of a lot of these people, they've had bad experiences with certain races. So it can take time to build trust and build a rapport. So those are the big things that I would say.
Right, exactly. And this kind of ties into actually my next question is how do you relate to patients and curb your own personal feelings and experiences that may conflict with caring for them?
So I think the most important thing is that we're all human, right? A lot of you are going into medicine, and they train us to be completely objective and kind of discard the emotional aspect and subjective. I think in any human interaction, each person has personal feelings and experiences which influence how we feel about each other. Even though we're virtual, we're having some sort of interaction, right? And you're building up some sort of opinion of me. You're having some feelings, right, of this interaction. And I'm doing the same thing with you. We're both kind of sorting things out. So that's completely normal. So in the physician-patient interaction, physician has feelings and opinions about the patient, whether they want to admit it or not. And the patient has the same with the physician. So being aware of your own feelings and past experiences, I think is the most important first step. I have biases. There are certain people that trigger certain feelings within me that I think can be very detrimental to the relationship with the patient. And I think the most important thing is just acknowledging that I have certain tendencies, that certain personalities might rub me the wrong way. And I think by identifying them, I can act to minimize them. Because I think, at least from a personal perspective, as soon as I say, you know, I treat everyone the same way, I don't have any biases, then I think it's much harder to correct anything that you're doing. So I think in the best way, I mean, to the best of our abilities, we try to do that, while also acknowledging that we all have personal histories and biases that are always going to influence how we view people in a personal setting as well as a professional setting.
And when you've come across kind of some situations, have you ever had to refer someone to another physician to help bridge this differential gap during treatment mediation? Not just in language, but just like communication, like body language or anything.
Yeah, definitely. So I think we're lucky in our clinic. We have a lot of in-person staff. So we have a lot of personal interpreters. We have a lot of staff that are from the communities and speak the language and can kind of serve as a buffer, as an interpreter, not only of language, but of these nuances of culture. But there's been several times where we didn't see eye to eye. There was interaction. I'm not even sure why, but the relationship didn't work. And I think that can be normal even within a culture. And they went on to see a different provider and ended up getting what I think was better care for them. And in particular, I can think of an Ethiopian gentleman that was just had some negative experiences with the medical system in the US. And based on that, really was very skeptical of the treatment we were offering. And I couldn't make any headway. He now sees someone from the Ethiopian community, and I think he's doing much better for that.
Have you been in situations where there was no other alternative care and you had to keep trying to treat the patient? And was that extremely challenging for you in a way?
Yeah, and that happens all the time. I think we're at a safety net hospital. So I think maybe for our Japanese students, maybe you're not as aware, but in America, you're not guaranteed healthcare. So a lot of people cannot access it. And then if you do access it, you can't afford it. So this place really is a last, there's no other options. So I think we have to be very careful when we're treating patients. So there are a number of patients that I think for whatever reason are not getting along with me, have been passed on to different providers, but there really aren't any other alternatives, and we're trying to do the best we can. Some of these patients have behavioral issues, schizophrenia, so things that are beyond cultural, but it's partially a way that our system is set up that there aren't many alternatives.
And did you say the term safety hospital?
Yeah, safety net.
Safety net. Okay, can
So,
you just give a
yeah.
definition of that for me?
So I don't know how it works in Japan, but in the US, if you go to specific hospitals and you don't have insurance and you don't have financing, they can turn you away if it's not a life-threatening issue. So there's only certain government hospitals that won't turn people away based of lack of insurance or based of financing, unless they have a life-threatening condition. So because of that, our hospitals, these governmental hospitals, end up treating a different population than others, specifically, typically people that have no other alternatives and don't have the means to go to other hospitals.
Right. We'll probably talk more in depth next week when we talk about the U.S. medical system as a whole in our next session. So this next question I'd like to ask, I believe this is the last question I have planned. So participants, if you have any questions, please get ready. There'll be a section soon for you to ask your own questions. You can use the raise your hand feature, or you can type it in the chat. But first, let me ask this question. So this is a kind of a personal question for me a little bit. And what are some of steps or advice to new medical staff to become better allies for the LGBTQIA+ community and open to treating people of differing gender identities?
Well, I think to start off with, I think there's a more of awareness in our culture, at least in America, probably recently, probably over the past 20 to 30 years, about gender identity and like these LGBTQ issues. I'm not sure where it is in Japan, but I know that there is a cultural change, at least over the past 20 to 30 years, which has similarly occurred. I think one thing that's important to note is that in my particular practicing situation where I'm treating mostly immigrants and refugees, they're coming from countries that are actually much more conservative than America. So you have to tread carefully because it's often in their communities, it's something that's not acceptable to have a different gender identity. And that includes just LGBTQ, just the most basic of just sexual orientation. So because of that, I tread more carefully, and there are probably many people that have different gender identities that I never uncover. However, that being said, I treat it much in the way as alcohol or drug use. That's not to say that it's something that's wrong, but it's something that can be stigmatized by society, and it's something that people want to hide. So the way that we phrase it, at least in the US, and I don't know how they do it in Japan in the medical system now, is instead of saying, do you drink alcohol, we say, how much alcohol do you drink? Rather than, how do you smoke, it's how much do you smoke? And then for sex questions, you say, do you have sex with men, women, or both? Kind of assuming that, this whole spectrum is completely normal. But I think it's very tricky when you're differing, even within the US, there's very different cultural norms. I think one interesting thing is in my training, I can only remember meeting 2 openly gay or homosexual providers. And when you look at the prevalence of it, of just LGBTQ in general, you realize that it's probably the same amongst all of these physicians at the era, and it just wasn't accepted career-wise and professionally for them to be out and to be open. this is changing and is going through a change in our society, but I think it's quite uneven. So I think just opening the door and coming off as much as possible of being non-judgmental. That being said, I'm sure there's a lot of people that were closeted that did not feel comfortable talking to me about it. And I probably need to learn more about things that I can do to elicit that. And I think it's the whole gamut, you know. I mean, there's a lot of stigmatized issues in various communities. Mental health issues, I think, are big up there. Any substance abuse, but I think they're all very similar. And I think anyone would be kidding you if they had a foolproof way of how to elicit these and make people feel comfortable.
Right. So, do you think that having more staff at hospitals who identify with like LGBTQ or transgender would create a safe space for these individuals to feel they can seek care?
I would expect so. I think so. I can't speak for them. And I know that especially in the Seattle, I don't know if anyone has seen the Seattle culture, the number of tattoos, things like that. There's a very alternative culture, I think, that's accepted in the hospital, that there's a lot of openly different gender identities, even in our own clinic, actually. And I do hope that that creates a sense of openness. But I think the fact that we're dealing with so many cultures that have a very, I think, strained relationship with these questions puts us kind of on the back foot. But in the hospital, especially with more American patients, I feel like I'm able to elicit them earlier.
Sort of like a culture clash.
Yeah, I think so. And trying to be respectful too, and try not to offend anyone, right?
Right.
It's like if you say, you know, if you think someone's mentally ill and you say they're crazy, then they're going to be, they take that as a personal affront, right? And so I think it can be tricky. And you're trying not to, their relationship with their own community here is so important. That's their survival line. That something like that, if it were to come out, I think they're terrified. You know, whether it be alcohol, whether it be something about their gender identity, can really break them off from their own cultural support network. And I think that's a big reason they don't come forward with it.
Right. I have another follow-up question based on just transgender or gender identities. Personal experience, an individual I had to go into the hospital, and I asked this question based on this experience, and they felt their gender was different from what they were born with and what was on their identification card. And so how can doctors treat a patient whose gender identity is different than what their biological or I guess current hormonal levels are? Is that a very, I'm not sure if I'm asking this eloquently, but like that's a tricky situation, I imagine.
Yeah, I think, well, I think Seattle's more progressive than most places. Our hospital also already has for gender in our electronic medical record, the gender that people want to have displayed, as well as pronouns. So I think that's helpful. So now that we look at it, I think I'm even actually from a different generation than a lot of you, where we didn't grow up thinking about this or pronouns or being proper with that. So I definitely slip up even when I know that I'm supposed to be using pronouns that don't necessarily match biological gender. But I think we're doing a better job. We're at least being aware of it. I think probably in the international clinic, we're on the latter end of dealing with these issues. But in the hospital as a whole, I think it's come up a lot. And I've definitely cared for a number of patients that were post-operative for gender transition surgery and a lot of mental health issues and distress. And I think largely because of lack of acceptance from their family and being cut off from their family. And just kind of in a very tough position where I think they didn't feel like they could confide or trust in anyone. So
all ties into trust with doctors, correct? Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. I would like to open the floor to other people. If you would like to ask a question to Dr. Reed, you have a question prepared, you can use the raise the hand function or type your question in the chat. Give you a few minutes.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in what you've come across too in your own university setting. I see international students there too. I'm curious as to what the dynamic or what experiences you've had or what questions. Because I realize that Japanese society is in a big flux and change as well. Because I follow it up on YouTube too, right? And seeing the lifestyles and the young generation, I think, is quite different now probably than even 20 years ago. So I'm very curious as to what, how you see what we're doing in the US or how you view Americans. And because we have a very specific way of doing things that I'm not sure how relevant or how pertinent it is to you at all times.
And have a question?
I have a comment.
Yes, Ruth.
I'm not a doctor, but I have been in Japan a long time, and I have had to think a lot about prejudice and discrimination and things being a foreigner here in Japan. And I really like what you said about bias, that I think all of us, when I hear someone who says, I have no bias, I have no prejudice, I don't believe it. It's there. And I think what you said, that it's really important to find our own biases and then try to fight them or try to extinguish them, to erase them. And it's a big challenge, but I really appreciate what you said about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and it can be hard in America too, because the way they phrase it is if you have any bias, then you're a racist, right? And they kind of vilify it and they don't normalize it and say, from wherever place that you're growing up, sir, there's certain cultural norms that certain people are treated differently than others. And then those become a part of how you see the world. And it doesn't make you a terrible person. It's probably a reality of how everyone interacts with the world and different people. And it's just being aware of it's the first step. And sometimes it's when you go to a different place and you're like, oh my goodness, they don't see the world the same way, or these groups of people or these interactions as I did. So, and that definitely happened to me. So.
Right. I like a lot of behavior is learned, and also behavior can change, and thoughts and ideas can change as well. People are capable of change as long as they're willing to adapt and, accept other ideologies and differences.
I have one more question. I'm hoping that if I ask a question, the students will start asking questions or have time to think of a question. So I don't want to take more time, but one question, my last question is, if a patient is assigned to a doctor who is a different gender, or anyway, that this doctor looks male but identifies as female or is really looking different, do you have a problem with patients refusing to being treated by that doctor?
It hasn't come up in terms of gender. It comes up in race a lot. Because part of our network, we worked with the military hospital, so the veterans of the military, and they have very strong feelings about race depending on where they served. So they would refuse certain providers. And it can be a tricky, in terms of, I think we're just now having more of an openness for providers in terms of gender identity to express that, but I expect something very similar to be happening. So I think it's a balancing act about, right, trying to deliver the best care possible while also protecting the providers. And I don't think there's a good answer. Because if there's a patient that doesn't want to be treated by a particular provider for whatever reason, it's probably in neither of their interests to have that being forced upon them. So
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah. But anyone from Ehime University, like, I'm kind of a foreigner here too, so don't be shy. I'm very curious in learning about any of your experiences, especially if you're from the area or if you're from outside the area, what your experiences. I see
We also-
Alifa signed back in, so hopefully that's a good sign.
We also have some students from Kangwon National University in Korea, and
Oh
Lee
wow.
Sung Kim says, I am a medical student. How could you deal with the local appraisal? For example, in Korea, people from region A doesn't like people from region B, and region is easily recognized by accent. So for me, I try to solve this problem to learn central accent. Is there any other better way?
Oh man, it's tricky, isn't it?
That sounds like a tricky question.
We have those issues, and so I think to summarize is the question is, you have two different groups or ethnic groups or slightly linguistic differences in Korea, and they're treated differently, it sounds like, when they interact. And the question was, how do you navigate that?
Correct, yes.
And the one way, it sounds like you mentioned, was maybe trying to emulate the accent of another group, which sounds problematic and difficult and imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I have a great understanding of it. It's tricky, and it happens in our clinic a lot, where there's a civil war going on in Ethiopia right now, and based on an accent, they can tell where an interpreter is coming from. And even though they speak the correct language, there's so much anger and resentment based on it that they'll refuse to interact with that interpreter. I think if you're a provider, I think it can be even trickier. In the US, we have those as well. Like, my accent is strange, but it's definitely like a northern, probably West Coast accent. And if you speak with a southern accent, there is probably going to be at least acknowledgement that there's a difference there. I don't know. Right. And I'm sorry that I don't have a good answer to it. I think hopefully the norms will change in Korea as well, because Korea as well has gone through this economic and cultural change that's been huge as well. So I think those things will change. But yeah, I think you navigate it as best you can, and you try not to use it as a prejudicial or weapon against others that you interact with, which is easy to do, right? Especially when someone doesn't speak the same variant of your language that you speak. It's easy to be dismissive or think that reflects upon their own intellect or capacity. So
do you think maybe trying to adjust your personal accent to match your patient's accent isn't the best solution?
It might be a short-term solution. Mm-hmm. The long-term solution might be outside of medicine, and might be a cultural thing that's going on.
Right.
But I think in your own medical, you do the best you can. Mm-hmm. And I guess if you're in the one that's considered the more dominant pronunciation group, I think you can make some concessions on how you speak. But the other way around, I think if the patient's looking down on you, I think it will be very tricky.
Yeah, language and accents are very difficult to navigate because there's so many biases. You know, you kind of judge someone based on how they sound, like, you know, difficult.
It's a good question, though, and that points up, yeah, it's a very, something that we don't think about very often.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Misung, for the question. Does anyone else have a question? I don't want to take up because I have lots of questions. I don't want to ask too many.
So I wanted to ask a question, but my question is kind of similar to what she just asked. So but then I just wanted to comment that your vast experience with different cultures and different scenarios is very inspiring. And so thank you for the nice lecture.
Well, where are you from, Alifa? Are you from, are you
Ghana.
Japanese?
No, I'm studying in Japan, but I'm from Ghana.
What city in Ghana are you from?
I'm from Accra, but originally from the northern part of Ghana.
Which city was there? What city or what area? I'm just
from
curious.
Kumbungu.
Kumbungu, okay. I studied snakes in Ghana, so I was going across. So.
Oh, that's nice.
But I know Ghanaians and Japanese, typically, there's a lot of cross-cultural.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
How has your experience been in Ehime, in the university?
Loved here, we have a lot of similarities, as you said, but there are a few challenges, but then it's kind of nice to be here and studying under a culture very different from my culture, and also looking at the similarities. And my interest is mostly in health disparities with children. So I find myself always looking and thinking, okay, this is different from here, and this is the same from where I'm coming from. So it's quite interesting for me.
And culturally, do you feel like you can understand where people are coming from when they talk to you now?
Yes, much better.
Do they understand where you're coming from when they talk to you?
Mostly no, but sometimes a little explanation just makes things clearer, because there is a lot of similarities, but then they just don't have experience of how it is back home. So, and mostly people don't know much about Africa here. So it's just the normal things that they see on TV. So sometimes a little, oh, it's actually different. And they're like, oh, really? Okay. And then that kind of just solved that problem.
So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Oh my God. Teru Kumagi, I think you sent me a direct message, but I'll give it a remind. I'm just going to read really quick some comments. This language is a barrier. Your talk reminded me of a litter clinic at Toronto General Western Hospital, one of the most popular liver centers in the world, and where I used to practice between 2006 and 2009. As you might know, Toronto is one of the cities with multiple races living together. In our clinic, we had many Chinese staff and staff who can speak Tagalog, Spanish, Portuguese, and others. It's good to know that there's also kind of that, also have them in Seattle.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the comment.
Definitely. And was it a good experience that you had there? I don't know which one you were. I don't mean to put you on the spot either.
Tara said they're currently at a Starbucks, so they cannot talk.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Thanks for tuning in from Starbucks. That connection to Seattle.
Yeah.
Judy, you have a question?
Yes.
Miyuka? Okay, please.
Yes. Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Shuri Tomioka from Ehime University. I'm first grade student and I'm learning about medical. So in my image, America is open to everyone, either he or she or they have so diversity backgrounds. So, but I have not visited to America ever. So I wonder, in there, so in the US, the opportunity for understanding LGBTQ is actively or not. Yeah, I wonder. Do you know my question? Do you understand my question?
I think so. My guess is it's easier or more accessible to understand or to learn about LGBTQ issues in the US. Is that what you are going?
Yes, so in your society, so people can get easier, can get
Like exposure.
opportunities.
Yeah, exposure.
Yes, studying. So I don't know about American society, so I'm interested in.
I think yeah. The question is probably, I think, accessibility to LGBTQ issues. I think America is a lot like Japan, right? Tokyo is a completely different place than Yorahime prefecture. And I think the US is like that too. So Seattle is like kind of a middle sized city or a larger city, but more kind of liberal, kind of like a New York, kind of in terms of its politics. So I think if you try to ask the same question about Japan, if you were from Tokyo, probably a lot more LGBTQ, I think, exposure is my guess, right? And a lot of like different lifestyles exposure. And I think Seattle is one that is actually quite open to it. But if you went to different parts of the United States, I think you would have as much trouble as probably most places in the world. So I think my bias is that it's probably bigger cities that are just more open to different sexual orientations, but also different ethnicities, just because there's enough people that people are interacting. Our university also works with students that come from Montana, Wyoming, and it's kind of like countryside, typically only one race. And they're quite shocked sometimes when they come here just about the interactions. I don't know so much about Ehime Prefecture, but I think because you're on the kind of an island too, it seems like those big cities are a little bit more distant. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So I think it could be tricky, but I think if I'm allowed to say this, I think the internet, at least even like YouTube and seeing the life in the day of some Japanese people, has really opened my mind about how life is in these different places. But I do think if you're in a big city, that your exposure to any type of minority, whether it be sexual minorities or ethnic minorities, is just much easier. You know, we can find Ethiopian restaurant here, Vietnamese restaurant. But if you go 200 miles away, or what is that, a few hundred kilometers away from here, that wouldn't be the case. So yeah, so I think it's just easier in a bigger city. So I think I see your point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sheree, may I ask? I'm gonna ask a follow-up question. So, kind of actually to both sides. So, Dr. Reed, talking about her question, are there like staff trainings or active classes staff take for LGBTQ issues or diversity issues? And Ehime students, do you take those types of diversity classes, LGBTQ resources? What's available, Dr. Reed?
So we do have those trainings, both for racial issues and gender, sexuality issues. I don't find them particularly helpful. I think what I learned the most was from patients or just friends and colleagues, right? And I think that tells you that the society is open enough that I have doctor colleagues that are very openly gay. And they've taught me a lot about just the gay scene in Seattle and specific health needs for that community. So I think a lot of it's maybe what you were hinting towards, Ms. Tomioka, is that it's just a lot of just exposure firsthand that makes you aware of the different issues that you would never be aware of. And yeah, and our university does a good job of trying to do trainings, but I think it doesn't compare to just talking to someone and saying like, oh, what's actually the deal with Seattle and your community.
Thank you.
Yeah, are there any trainings in Ahime University for gender or sexuality?
You questioned me?
Yeah.
Yeah, or anyone from Ahime. Am I allowed to?
Actually, I don't know about LGBTQ and their to dealing with the LGBTQ in Ehime Prefecture or Ehime University. So yeah, if I had opportunity, I had some professor who are very friendly with me. So I will ask them how to dealing with LGBTQ. So yeah. So now in my feeling, in Ehime, it's not actively for LGBTQ understanding. So yeah.
No, thank you for that answer. I'm curious too. I might look it up and see what they have for your region, because yeah, it varies region to region. But if I could add one more thing, the only openly gay or homosexual physicians in medicine were the HIV doctors. So when HIV became a big issue in 1980s and 1990s, it predominantly at first affected the gay community. And because of that, there was so much activism, and it empowered a lot of these infectious disease doctors. So if you want to learn anything about sex or things, it's these infectious disease doctors, because nothing will make them blush. And they actually do know a lot. You know, the intricate details of disease transmission is very technical, and it's things that you would never think of possibly. So they are actually an incredible resource. And I think they were always in just infectious disease, but now I think that population of doctors is now in other specialties, and is very helpful as well. And I think if you had even a visiting doctor at Ahime University, I think it might be an incredible kind of learning experience to have someone like that, because even for us, it opens eyes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It seems like there's a lot of meeting chat comments too.
Yeah, there's so I think Margaret wanted to ask a question. If you want to ask your question, Margaret. Oh, I can't hear you, Margaret.
I think her microphone might not be.
Microphone. Margaret, I think your microphone's not working at the moment. Maybe mute and unmute yourself.
Hello.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, thank you, Jason, for the opportunities for me to ask the questions. And thank you, Dr. Duncan, for your sharing. I love your sharing very much, especially in terms of the topic that everyone is talking about right now is LGBTQIA in healthcare, yes, area. And I learned from your sharing, Dr. Duncan, that the identity of gender in specific, like LGBTQIA, there's some like not really, I mean, not really accepted, but not very open for the moment. So that hinder from the people to receive the health service and also the provider of health service. some disadvantages. So I would like to hear from yours, like any solutions that medical field, like physician or medical professional, to have to deal with that, to have the LGBTQIA, they have the identity in this area to support both the patients and the physician in healthcare sector. Thank you.
So I think to paraphrase the question is what other things can be done to facilitate access of medical care for people of the LGBTQI community? Is that?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. And I think there's two sides. There's two sides to it. There's the medical side, which I think is probably the easier side. And then the other side is the societal side. And I think what happens and what traditionally happened in the United States is that you weren't allowed to be open professionally. The ramifications of being openly gay would be detrimental to your career, right? It would be career ending. So a lot of the practices that occurred were all hidden from view and led to a lot of risky sexual behavior just because it couldn't be done out in the open. And I think depending on the culture, a lot of those issues still exist, right? If you're from one of the more traditional cultures in Seattle and you're found to be openly gay, I think a lot of doors in that society close to you. We do have a specific clinic. It was based around HIV positive people, but I think the vast majority of people, at least at the beginning, identified as LGBTQI. And I think they are probably considered the safest or the most welcoming, or maybe the most sensitive to the issues of that community. So I think if you're at least open, I think that's a great option and you'll get very good care and probably have a higher chance of getting an LGBTQI provider. The only issue is, and we have some both closeted and openly gay individuals in our clinic, they don't want to go to the other clinic because if people see that they go there, they'll know that it won't be something that they can hide anymore. So I think what you're highlighting is a very tricky situation. How can you elicit, elicit the truth from patients about what their identity is, while also keeping it confidential from their greater social network. And, you know, I'm not part of that community, so I probably have less experience. I think probably just being a member of that community, you know that you have to walk along different lines and have different, they call it code switching in America now. You know how you create a different identity based on who you talk to. And it can be based on your ethnicity. I think our Korean student who mentioned that there's two different ways of speaking. So the code switching might be, say, you have to speak a different way to different providers. So I think the unresolved thing in my mind that I probably need to think about more is how do you deliver care to these minority groups that are still not out in the open? And it sounds like maybe in the Hime prefecture, you have some of those same issues in terms you definitely have the people that are there to have those needs, but how do you address it in a way that keeps them confidential and makes them safe? So I don't have a great answer and I apologize for that. But I think there's probably a lot of people working on it. And I think that's a great example of someone who's probably from the community as a provider, probably has more lived experience and probably has a better idea of how to navigate that. So just another reason to have a greater diversity of providers.
Yep.
But thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for the questions and I appreciate your answers very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that it is the discrimination in gender or race is built a lot from social matters rather than the matter itself. Itself doesn't matter because they are people, and the gender discrimination or race discrimination is only from the social matters, and we need some like solution from both sides, every side related.
Yeah. I think acknowledging that everyone's related, I think, is a good step. And I think it's the fact that you have so many different people from across the world studying in a Hime University, I think is very helpful too.
Yeah.
I think just, what is it, Alifa with a Ghanaian patient student, I think just so that people have a face from Ghana to know that person, I think can be immensely helpful, right?
No.
And what are the chances of that happening, you know, in a Hime prefecture? It's such a, I think, a gift, and I think that's the importance of these exchange programs. So very nice to have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. As we're coming up to near the end of the time, I did want to open it up again to other questions, but I do have a wrap-up question. If no one else has another question they wish to ask.
I think Nada made a comment on the chat.
Oh yeah.
But maybe it's just
one of the many aspects I feel happy about being in Seattle is that I got to learn more about the LGBTQ community. Since back home in Lebanon, we didn't really have much awareness about these current social issues until a few years ago.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the power of like knowledge, right? Learning, and then you can understand each other.
And it's interesting too. I mean, Lebanon, I'm sure, has a pretty big LGBTQI scene. I can only imagine, right? Just based on the relative liberalism of their community. But a lot of our staff say, you know, and a lot of countries will say this too, that, oh, they don't have LGBTQI community in my country, right? And it's just that they have to be so hidden. They exist in every country. And the fact that you're not aware of them probably tells you more about your own identity and the own circles that you travel in.
I mean, I wouldn't say the LGBTQ or the queer community is huge in Lebanon. They're mostly centralized in Beirut, which is a small area of Lebanon, and the community is growing as years pass, that is for sure. And up until a few years ago, we started having classes about gender awareness and gender and identity and race in colleges. So it's definitely a growing community, and but it wasn't big enough to teach me to not get exposed to the cultural shock of being in the States, that's for sure. And I guess I'm very lucky to be in Seattle and learn more and more about the community on a first-hand basis.
Yeah, I think that's great feedback. Yeah, and I think Beirut, and I think it probably just exists it's just in the shadows. It's something that it's harder to find.
Right.
This is like slightly related. I don't know. There was a guy he was doing analysis of Google searches, and he was studying pornography trends, because even in the US, they say, you know, southern states that are more conservative say, you know, this LGBTQ thing is not an issue in their states. They say, you know, it's more of a big city thing. But they looked at the pornography searches based on what the keywords were, and they realized that what they're searching for, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual content, is exactly the same across all of these regions, which leads me to believe, that, you know, biologically or personally, there's one prevalence, but then you need enough openness and safety to have a community. So, but I think you brought up a very good point. But to me, that struck me, and I was like, okay, yeah, these issues exist everywhere. You're just maybe not aware of them because you're not a part of that group.
There's also a lot of people who are still closeted about their own identities because of the society there, and we still have till today psychologists who try to do conversion therapy on their patients. And I guess when it comes to places like searching pornography, it's more of a private matter that you can do on your own without being exposed to social judgment. So it's a very interesting point that you brought up.
And then when you see a physician actually in the medical office, part of it is a very private thing, but part of it's kind of public too. So
Right.
you're right on that threshold, and that's where it gets dicey. Because if it were purely private and they had pure confidence that nothing would get out and that you wouldn't know them or identify them, then I think you could elicit a lot of these concerns. But it's a
Right.
semi-public, right? You sit in a waiting room, people in your community know where you're going. I think
Yeah,
those things. Yeah. So yeah,
absolutely.
thank you for bringing that up. And then just to be clear, that conversion therapy still exists in the US. There's still hate crimes against LGBTQI community in this country. So you're getting a picture of it in Seattle, but I think you get outside
Right.
the big cities, things probably are not too different than what you saw in Lebanon.
Do you have an idea where they're
Yeah,
abundant
there's
in the
issues.
States where
Yeah,
there's like still conversion therapy being applied
yeah, I think a
around the
lot of
States?
it has at least some relationship to religion, some forms of it, kind of a more orthodox or extremist interpretation of
Oh,
religious views.
got it.
Is
Thank
my,
you for that.
is my
Thank you.
hopefully not too politically incorrect way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, we're getting to the end of the session. So Dr. Reed, I want to ask a wrap-up question, just briefly, like after this discussion today about LGBTQ issues and even patient-staff relationships and diversity, what 3 soft skills do you think are important to improve patient-staff relationships? If you had to list just 3 skills.
3 soft skills.
Yeah. Just
Maybe I'll step back 1 second and I'll tell you.
Yeah.
The things that improve. So I studied fish, right? And if you're Japanese, then Japanese people like fish a lot. So then you don't think it's so strange. And the US is kind of strange. And then I transitioned to the medical field. And I think the biggest things that changed in me was I typed faster, but also I became immensely more patient, probably in my personal life as well, because you're dealing with people that are just, you're seeing them in extremis. They're dealing with very severe issues, suffering a lot. And I think as Nada pointed out, they're in between this very private and intimate relationship they have with you, and it's also public. If you're in a hospital, all people are seeing you, things are out in the open. So I think developing a sense of patience, which I think develops from a sense of just kind of empathy and understanding, right? I think, and it helps just knowing people from these different communities, and I think it demystifies it. Sharing moments with just various people, I think helps you become more empathetic. And that's not to say that I don't have biases. I do. I grew up in a country that's, fundamentally, I think in a lot of ways racist. And I've internalized a lot of things that I don't even realize I do. So I think this patience and empathy and giving people a chance, and I think you have incredible opportunity at Ehime University to do that, since you have these exchange programs. And I think maybe you don't realize how lucky you are to be in a university environment when you are allowed to have these exposures, and I think develop that. And I think probably Alifa, even when she was interacting with people, she learned patience, right? Because there's a lot of mixed up communication that I'm sure occurs. So I think that one is the biggest thing. The second one, I think, probably that I'm still working on, but it's helped, is just leaving more space for people to talk. Maybe I talked too much on this and I cut people off, but I think just in the patient interaction is just leaving enough space where people can think about and come up with something they didn't really want to ask you. And I think at least American society, I don't know how pauses are viewed in Japanese society, probably more favorably. But in American society, if there's even a pause in any interaction, people get very anxious and try to fill it in. I think I probably did that actually during the Zoom talk, and I apologize for that. But I think with an interaction with one patient, I think giving that downtime and not stepping on people's toes is probably a huge skill that improved getting good information. Because if you want to talk the whole time and talk over people, you'll get exactly the information you were looking for, and you can be completely wrong. And then I think those are the 2 things. I said patience. I said leaving more time. And then I guess third, I would just say the thing that would be helpful, I think, as a provider, what I've, I'm pretty young, but I'm not as young as you guys anymore, but I'm realizing just the finite amount of time that we have. So I think realizing that we have such a gift just to be alive and how quickly it can be taken from so many people, I think was something that I process on a very, very frequent level. So I think what happened in medicine is that I can step back and realize all these things that I thought were very important, having things done in a particular way, you really realize that they're not that important. And that our time, when I was in my 20s or 30s, I felt like I had the whole life, and I'm only at 40 and you're starting to realize things are finite and things are very uncertain. So I think taking advantage of getting to see exchange students, taking advantage of all of those things, I think will make you a better person. And then if you end up being in medicine, make you, I think, more fascinated and more receptive to patients, right? Realizing that you don't have forever. So I think those are the three things, hopefully, if I didn't get too deep into it. But I think just appreciative, just realizing that what you have is a lot better than probably the majority of people on Earth.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Reed. Everyone, let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our time here. I was wondering if Dr. Osawa, if you wanted to say a few words at the end, or Ruth, if you'd like to say anything.
I think, Osawa Sensei.
This is Osawa from Ehime University. First of all, thank you for your great talk on the very important issue, Dr. Reed. And also, I'd like to thank FIUTS team for organizing this attractive program. And also, I thank you for all the students for attending this program. Just for the students, don't be shy and talk each other and interact each other actively and have a great fun. Thank you.
All right. I guess this is time to say good night and good day to people in Japan. Ellen, would you like to say anything as well?
Something about the bulletin board?
Oh, yes. I will send the bulletin board the link to Discord again to everyone's emails one more time tonight. And you should get another one. And it's with some instructions. If you need help, just give me an email as well. Okay?
Thank you.
And please, for all of these sessions, first of all, Dr. Reed, thank you again so much. This was amazing. And I learned so much. I think we all learned a lot, and we really are so grateful for your time and your thoughtful answers to all the questions. Just could not have asked for a better speaker to kick off the program. So thank you so much. And I hope that all the participants will consider this Zoom session to be the beginning of the conversation. And then over the course of the next week on the Discord and the bulletin board, you will be able to be in that online space with each other and with staff and with your ambassadors as well. And you'll have a chance to continue the conversations that we all started today, to continue to get to know each other, to continue to talk about topics related to culture and healthcare and medicine and all different kinds of things. So please join that group as soon as you can. Keep an eye out for information about it from Jason. And if you have any trouble, just let Jason know and he can help you get logged onto that, because that's a really important opportunity to continue all of these great conversations. So that is all I have to say. Thank you so much, everybody, for being a part of this program. We are grateful to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Osawa
Thank you.
Sensei.
Thank you.